Good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. I'm Peter Thompson, the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we explore important issues at the intersection of faith and the modern world. We're very honored today to welcome Anthony Pinn, the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities at Rice University, who will be talking with us about the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Professor Pinn is the author or editor of many books, including a book about Murray and a collection of Murray's writings. Professor Pinn, we're so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you. Greetings from Houston. This is what I'd like to do. I'd like to make an opening statement and then we'll chat after that. Over the course of some years, I've tried to learn important lessons from Reverend Dr. Murray. And central to her being, the way in which she touched the world and was touched by the world involved relationship. For her, relationship was both a moral imperative and an ethical obligation. And I think you get some sense of that in the way in which she continuously engaged folks through letters. For her, conversation was vital. And so I want to try to model that today. I'll open with a statement and then we'll chat. And I think that kind of process would make Reverend Dr. Murray happy. I want to begin by saying that my early introduction to Reverend Dr. Murray wasn't intentional. I was working through my dissertation and I was trying to make some sense of late 20th century theological developments along the lines of liberation theologies. And I was thinking through Black theology and womanist theology and trying to get a sense of the intersections, trying to get a sense of when these two are bridged and how they're bridged. In working through the library, through the stacks, I'd gone to get a particular book, but as was my practice, I looked around, and it was during one of those days of looking around that I stumbled across her autobiography and started reading it. And it became clear to me that she was a significant figure, that we understood her deep importance with respect to legal arguments. We had a sense of her deep significance with respect to social justice work, particularly around the issue of gender bias. What we had failed to give significant attention to was her theological and religious formulation, the way in which theological development and religious commitment shapes the last years of her life. Pauli Murray was one who believed in a soft form of destiny. That is to say, for her, there is a particular set of skills and capacities that is ours. And the formation of relationships over the course of our lives allow us opportunity to better forge and utilize those skill sets. And if we are mindful of that development over time, we see a push toward particular engagements, particular ways of being in the world, particular vocational opportunities and commitments. For Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, as she reflected back, she realized that from a very early age, there was something about her family, something about her personal development that involved religiosity. And this would come to play an important role for her as an individual, that her movement through the world, her efforts as an attorney, her efforts as an educator, her efforts as an activist were always tied to an individual commitment to religious well-being. So much of herself is funneled through the workings of the church. There are a series of developments that shift this for Murray, that pull her out of the legal realm, that pull her out of higher education and make involvement in religiosity more than individual fulfillment, but her destiny. She outlines two developments. One, the death of her aunt. And secondly, the death of her dear friend. I want to argue that with the death of these two fundamentally important figures for her, there is through death the disruption of two forms of love. And it requires a different commitment to a third form of love, agape, that transforms and says something new about our capacity in the face of death, that motivates Murray to move into ministry. This required a different vocabulary and grammar for understanding life and new ways of expressing it, theology and ministry. She also argues that at Barlow's funeral, Tom Pike mentions that the work she had done, the way in which she had moved through the fundamentally disruptive nature of this death, had something to do with ministry. And he asked her the question if she had ever considered ordination. And she argues she thought about that, reflected on it, and recognized that ministry was the last dimension of her life, the last way in which she would touch the world and be touched by the world. Her long-standing sense of mission would be shaped and articulated through theological education, and her poetic sensibilities would be expressed in liturgy, and her legal mind trained on the maximizing of human potential consistent with the image of God would underwrite her theological development. There is something about her poetic sensibility that is ultimately reflected not in legal briefs, not in statements lodged in her protest, but through the sermonic moment. And so Murray would leave a good position that she had fought for at Brandeis and enter seminary in 1973. She'd be ordained in 1977. Now, much of Murray's thinking, even prior to her movement into ministry, is informed by the social gospel. But it's not a form of the social gospel that is ignorant of the social codes that inform life. Her sense of the social gospel is much more in line with the thinking of Bishop Reverdy C. Ransom of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That is to say, she, like those two, understood that Christian commitment, what it meant to be Christ-like, involved an effort to transform the world, and that for her, transforming the world had to involve real attention to racial and gender injustice. Pauli Murray works to blend Black theology and feminist theology through this commitment to relationship. She remains informed by a kind of personalism, the recognition that personality is fundamental, committed to the social gospel, and informed through the best of liberal theology. Making use of this framework, she wrestles with human suffering. She's wrestling with a theologically informed way of speaking to the intersections of race, gender, and class. She wants to think religiously in terms of mutuality. And this, for my mind, involves a push away from Martin Luther King Jr. and in the direction of Howard Thurman. She understands that religious traditions share a basic divine spark or impulse. And it's this shared impulse that allows for a sense of mutuality and dialogue. It allows us to harness a kind of creative force that allows us to do really good work in the world. Religiously and theologically, she is both pro-Black and pro-woman. For her, there were distinctions that had to be made between what she was doing theologically and what was being done in feminist circles. For her, feminists failed to fully account for and recognize the significance of race, that some of the women are Black. And with Black theology, she was troubled by a variety of things. One, its rather loose conversation concerning violence. Secondly, she was troubled by its ontological Blackness. That is to say that Black theology in the form dominated by James Cone involved a sense of everything revolving around Blackness. That to understand Blackness is to understand the best of human life, and it is to understand God. For Murray, identity was much more complex and layered than Blackness and ontological Blackness allowed for. Murray was also concerned that Black theology did not give adequate attention to the next step. Sure, freedom, liberation of fundamental importance, the dismantling of injustice of fundamental importance. But for Murray, there needed to be another step that took place simultaneously, and that was reconciliation. And this commitment to liberation and reconciliation moved her out of the orbit of James Cone and pushed her in the direction of J.D. Otis Roberts. For her, this was of fundamental importance, the nature of relationship, which is fundamental to her theology. In fact, you can say that what Murray offers as a bridge between Black theology and feminist theology is a theology of relationship, a theology that is premised upon the safeguarding of human dignity, understood in terms of our ability for inclusion and unity. This of fundamental importance for her. In terms of ethics, she makes another move that is shadowed in Black theology and feminist theology, but not quite articulated in the same way. That Pauli Murray was known to understand herself as America's problem child. And for her, this wasn't just a quick and flippant way of thinking about herself. In the same way that John Lewis talked in terms of good trouble, Pauli Murray talked in terms of the benefit, the transformative power of the problem acted out. That if we want to make fundamental change in the context of our collective life, it involves us being willing to be problems, to move through the world in a way that disrupts in order to heal. I believe now, and I will continue to believe, that there is a tremendous amount we learn from Pauli Murray concerning a transformative religious vocabulary and grammar. So much we learn from her in terms of a creative and imaginative moral and ethical compass. So much we learn from her concerning the value of relationship as we touch the world and are touched by the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Pinn. If you have questions for Professor Pinn, I encourage you to use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can simply email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Professor Pinn, I know that there are some folks watching who don't know too much about Murray's life in general. So can you give us kind of a little bit of a background leading up to her ordination in the Episcopal Church and the theological turn in her life? What had she done up to that point that makes her so of note?
Yeah. She grows up in a relatively large family, and it's a family that is wrestling with race dynamics, right? So there are members of her family who are passing and members who are not. But what was clear within the context of her family was that folks might negotiate race in terms of their personal lives, but in terms of the collective, in terms of community, they had to be about the business of transformation. Her family is disrupted. Her father is killed, right? There are disruptions in her family that result in her going to live with one of her aunts. And for her, this is a transitional moment that it exposes a different level of racial disregard. For her, the death of her father had everything to do with racial animosity and racial discard that colored, so to speak, life within the context of the United States. She would eventually move to New York and go to Hunter College, her thinking being that the restrictive policies of North Carolina would not allow her to flourish. So she goes to Hunter. She becomes involved in social protest, and there are some major moments for her in terms of social protest. So for example, 1940, she's arrested and thrown into prison because she and someone she's traveling with refuse to act right, according to the bus driver, right? They're in uncomfortable seats and they want to move out of those seats and they're negotiating that. And then the bus driver hands out these cards, a kind of in case of emergency cards, but they aren't given to the Black passengers. So for Murray, this is not okay. This is a fundamental problem. She lets the driver know this. He stops the bus, gets off, comes back with the police, they're arrested. And for her, this was an opportunity to think racial justice, but to think about it in relationship to the teachings of Gandhi, for example. So they apply these strategies within the context of that confinement. And for Murray, she says that it was this engagement with the others who were there through love, cooperation, and a recognition of human dignity that was transformative. And this because of fundamental importance for her. It's through conversation with some folks that Murray begins to recognize that the next stage for her had to involve the law. Rethinking the United States through a rethinking of law and policy. Going to University of North Carolina isn't an option. Going to Harvard is not an option. She goes to Howard University, and at Howard, Murray claims that she is involved in the thinking that would ultimately be used to transform educational system. She undertakes some other activities in terms of the law, right? And she's deeply involved, but at another point, she decides that it is really higher education that is calling her. So you see Murray kind of moving through these various vocations with the same goal of transforming life, of highlighting and calling for greater recognition of human dignity and integrity of life. She moves into higher education, Brandeis, and this isn't going so well. This is during a period of Black power. There's a shift in language, and Murray is much more comfortable with being called a Negro than being called Black or African American. For her, that captured the complexities of her individual life, but also the complexities of identity for folks within the United States. She's involved in church during these periods, and she's trying to work through her relationship to church in a way that brings into play gender justice. So she's calling the Episcopal Church to do a different type of work in terms of gender justice. And at one point, Murray says, the church isn't getting this right. And because the church isn't getting this right, it doesn't deserve my presence. And so she steps aside, leaves the church for a while. The church isn't doing right, so it doesn't deserve my presence. She will ultimately come back, and she's continuously flirting. There's a creative tension between these more secular ventures on her part and her religious and theological commitments and obligations. And again, it's with the death of these significant figures within her life that she recognizes the inability to fully capture what is of fundamental importance to her, the depth of human integrity, the depth of our connection. She cannot capture that in a way that makes sense of death. And so it's at that point that Murray says, okay, enough, I surrender. It's ministry.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about her relationship to the Episcopal Church specifically. She's the first Black woman to be ordained in the Episcopal Church, and what it was like for her in this institution that was so white and so male, to be a problem, to be an agent of change, as well as kind of a faithful pastor and priest.
Oh, she had a long love, discomfort relationship with the Episcopal Church. So even before moving into ministry herself, she fought to have women ordained, right? She's part of a commission that is charged with thinking through this issue. As she's moving in, right, she's of advanced age, and she is all about the business of speaking her mind. She's having a difficult time at General, because you've got some students who think she's taking up too much space. And there are letters available in her archival materials that kind of speak to this. And one student in particular is complaining about her taking up so much space in the classroom, taking up so much space in terms of campus culture. And she writes and says, look, this has been a long, hard battle that's been painful, and that she will speak this pain and speak this truth, period. Right? But she's struggling with this, how to bring in this rather aggressive social justice agenda, how to bring in this public protest that had been part of her life, how to bring this in to a religious setting, a tradition that was slow to move. And so there's some give and take between Murray and the church, give and take. And I think the last year of her training at Virginia Theological Seminary was transformative for her, and that it also gave her an opportunity to think about difference in more productive ways, and to think about difference in a way that did not already and always situate it as a problem to solve. And so she's having this struggle, she's having this relationship, trying to push the Episcopal Church to be its better self, but trying to figure out ways to communicate that, and to communicate so that it could be heard.
What's fascinating about her is that she's this figure of confrontation, but also of reconciliation in this kind of last period of her life. The story of she goes to Chapel of the Cross in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where she, ancestors, both Black and white ancestors, had been members kind of on either sides. And she gives a sermon from the pulpit that's dedicated in honor of a white ancestor who had been a slaveholder. I'm curious about the reconciliation aspect of her ministry and how that related to the confrontational aspects of her ministry.
Yeah, I mean, Murray understood the complexities and the messiness of relationship, right? She understood the messy nature of life within the context of the United States. And so this push for inclusion, this push for unity was not without a deep concern and demand for justice, right? So this wasn't reconciliation that required nothing of oppressors. It required everything of oppressors, right? But it was an opportunity available to them that wasn't available through the more radical move of Black theology and more radical dimensions of feminist thought. And so this was vital for her, and so much of her ability to kind of conceive this coming together is premised upon the workings of her own family, right? Within the context of her family, you see this often messy effort to move through two legacies and to hold these legacies in creative tension. And for Murray, this was important because she understood the need to blend, to hold in creative tension, the individual and the collective. And so personal life for her became a way of seeing opportunity on the collective level. There were ways for her to blend these two. Now, Murray also understood and made this argument, right? That one of the things she had to work through theologically was racial injustice. What can you say about God in light of this sort of misery in the world? And for her, there were ways in which Black life afforded productive lessons for advancement. That if we gave a deep attention to the ways in which Black folks have moved through the world, we gain insight into how we might transform the country. And for her, one of those mechanisms was the way in which religion functioned within Black communities. And so for her, the church became an opportunity and a mechanism for transformation. So she could go to North Carolina and say, here is an opportunity for reconciliation, for bringing together the best of our intent, the best of our capacity, in a way that holds us accountable, but does not hamstring us.
We know that she was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, that she influenced Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Thurgood Marshall said her book was a kind of Bible for the civil rights movement. Do we know if she interacted with Martin Luther King Jr. and had kind of influences on the March on Washington, et cetera?
Well, what we do know is that Murray was not shy about writing folks, right? So this correspondence wasn't simply with Roosevelt, but she made it her business to write to W.E.B. Du Bois, to Martin Luther King Jr., and point out their shortcomings, right? So it isn't clear to me that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly utilized this critique, but he was certainly aware of the shortcomings because she was not shy about pointing out these dilemmas, pointing out the inconsistencies, that for her, the civil rights movement could not fulfill its obligations and its potential if it did not take seriously the needs of women. She made this radically apparent. It seems to me you could look at the civil rights movement and look at the friction between the dominant figures within the civil rights movement and the work of women within the civil rights movement, and argue that if he heard Murray, if leadership in the civil rights movement heard Murray, they did not transform their activities based upon Murray. That there was something about gender dynamics, that particular social code that was held in place within the context of civil rights struggle. But Murray, as America's problem child, was all about the business of pointing it out. It would not go unspoken.
Again, if you have questions for Professor Pinn, you can use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. One person asks, what other factors constrained Murray's life aside from race?
Gender and class. Right, and let's think about Murray, and let's think about this medical emergency of hers, a kind of nervous breakdown, right? And in her papers, she identifies the way in which she had not spoken her personal truth, right? She had not made it known that she was a lesbian, and that this hidden information, this hidden segment of herself was doing deep damage. Not speaking this truth was doing deep damage. So you get a sense here that for Murray, it's a matter of race, class, gender, and sexuality.
Recently, some scholars have speculated that kind of retroactively Murray could be classified as transgender. What are your thoughts on that issue? Apparently, she had written in her diaries, talked at times about feeling like a man. Any reflections?
I would say that Murray's gender and sexuality are complex, but I'd be cautious in terms of imposing a category on her, right? In the same way that there are early Black women who are about the business of transformation, but I don't know that I would label them womanist, right? In the same way with Murray, I think it's sufficient to argue that her gender and sexuality were complex, and that Murray wrestled with what could be known publicly and what could not be known publicly, and it had impact. Trans, I don't know.
Mm. How did she navigate that boundary between what could be public and what couldn't?
Well, we get some sense Barlow is her friend. And there's every reason to believe that that is an understatement of Barlow's significance, right? But you don't get Murray making these, right? So Murray makes public and aggressive statements concerning racial identity and the demands with respect to gender equality, but not in terms of her sexuality. This isn't, as far as I can tell, explicitly named in her work. But I think you get with Murray the ability to navigate that to some extent through her recognition of the importance of individuality in relationship to collective identity, right? So on the level of the individual, she could maintain this, forge relationships that were not necessarily public, and hold that in creative tension with her public identity and public presentation.
We have one question about what we can learn from Murray in terms of strategies to affect change. How did she think one could most effectively influence society?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to take away from Murray is the deep value of discomfort. That part of what we have to do as America's problem children is be loud and disruptive, create discomfort. Right? That, it seems to me, that is the proper ethical posture according to Murray. Be a problem that continuously causes discomfort.
Can you talk about her role within the feminist movement? I know that she's listed as one of the co-founders of the National Organization of Women.
I mean, yeah, she's deeply involved. I mean, she's a major figure with now early on, right? I mean, this is a commitment for her. She is working to blend a demand for racial justice with gender equality, and she has insights that are missing in these separate camps, and she's using that as a way to forge relationship between the two. But Pauli Murray is deeply involved. I think there are ways in which Pauli Murray's public recognition is perhaps greater in terms of gender justice than racial justice. Right? She is involved in the formation of institutions and structures, new ways of thinking and communicating. And Murray is doing really great work in terms of racial justice. But what you often get from Murray is, this is the public strategy used by Thurgood Marshall, for example. I was involved in putting that together. Right? Or this is what public figures are doing. I've been writing and demanding that they do this sort of work. But it's much more public, much more integral to the very development of structures for gender justice.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg many times, publicly gave Murray credit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so she gets, she's recognized for this, for the kind of undergirding work she's done, particularly, again, in terms of racial justice. But again, my argument would be, in terms of gender justice, it's much more explicit, it's much more public, and her leadership roles are without question.
How was she viewed by folks within those movements when she went on for ordination? Was this seen as kind of Murray kind of giving up her work in those areas, or as a kind of extension of that work?
Well, I mean, I think in large part, they're taking her lead, and she crafts it, right? That she argues that she remains committed to equality. She remains committed to liberation, justice, and freedom, but there are dimensions of that struggle that are spiritual and moral in nature, and that requires a different set of tools. So Mary is quite clear that she is not giving up this other work, but she's recognizing that there are dimensions of it that cannot be fully handled without some deep and sensitive engagement with the moral and spiritual dimensions.
So I believe you wrote your book about Murray in 2008. And since then, she's been kind of named a saint or included in our calendar of holy people in the Episcopal Church. Since then, Yale has named a college after her. There's a major documentary coming out about her. What do you make of this increased interest in her life? And what do you think that says about where we are right now?
I think in the context of the United States, this is a troubled moment, right? In terms of issues of justice, death dealing circumstances, this is a troubled moment. And in part, what I see taking place is a deep and aggressive effort to find models, right? To find models that give us a sense of how to move forward, how to communicate our troubles and how to communicate our hopes and aspirations, looking for models. And turning to Martin Luther King Jr. alone is insufficient, right? And so I think you get an appeal to Murray because she offers a way of thinking about these issues, engaging these issues, and doing it recognizing complexity, the layered and messy nature of identity within the context of the United States. And it's not lost on me that this turn toward Murray first involves her work with respect to legal challenges to discrimination. Religion comes along later, right? But it's Murray as a legal mind that first captures our attention. How do we rethink the policies and the procedures of life in the United States in a way that makes equality, equity fundamental to our vision, right? And so folks turn to Murray, the legal mind. We've been slower to recognize her importance in terms of religiosity.
What do you think Murray would have to say about the challenges of our time? What would she say after the murder of George Floyd? What would she say about movement for trans rights, et cetera?
She would not be surprised by the dilemmas we face, because during her decades of activism, the US response to difference, it's racial, gender, class, sexuality disregard, right? The way in which populations are demonized and destroyed, she's aware of this. She encounters it. This would not be a surprise. I think what Murray would encourage us to do is continue to push, demand change, produce discomfort. And so I can't say with any certainty, because only Murray could say with fundamental certainty, but I think she would see Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives and smile. That there's a kind of complexity of engagement there that understands the need and the value of relationship, that understands identity as complex and layered, something about that. And the kind of discomfort it produces, the way in which it disrupts the norms and status quo, I think she'd be all about that.
We have time for a few final questions, again, using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or my email, pthompson@stbarts.org. Someone asks how Murray suffered for being a problem.
Well, I think Murray suffered because of issues of gender, class, sexuality, and race, right? That she embodied things that trouble the status quo in the United States. So her very occupation of time and space created a dilemma for her. I think with respect to being a problem, it was in that context where she best felt herself. It was being America's problem child that asserted for her her dignity, her value, her integrity.
Someone asks if you can speak more about the disagreements Murray had with James Cone.
Yeah, there are several things that troubled her, and she made this known to James Cone. She made this known to Robert. She was involved in this Society for the Study of Black Religion. She gave a paper during one of its meetings, so it was no surprise. But one, she found this preoccupation with Blackness troubling, that it did not speak to the complexity of identity. For her, this was a problem. Black power was also troubling for her, that it undercut and short-circuited opportunity for reconciliation. This she did not agree with. James Cone's willingness to think about violence, right? So James Cone argues, look, oppressors don't get to tell us what strategies are applicable. He argued that in the context of the United States, when the police are busting heads, it's called law and order. When the oppressed are fighting back, it's violence. So he said, the larger society doesn't get to determine the proper vocabulary and grammar for defining and naming experience. For Murray, this was a bit troubling, that she saw no benefit in violence, that there was no way to get towards the kind of love and reconciliation necessary to transform the world through this aggressive rhetoric that marked Black theology. For her, this did not work. Now, also keep in mind that Black theology at this point has little to say concerning issues of gender and sexuality. So you can argue that as Black theology understands it, those who suffer are Black, but they're men, right? Because transformation and freedom is thought from the perspective of male gender, that there's a way in which struggle and liberation is viewed through a grammar of masculinity. And for Murray, this is a problem. You cannot talk about liberation. You cannot talk about freedom and not acknowledge the needs of Black women. This would gain theological nuance through womanist thought, figures like Jacqueline Grant and Katie Cannon and Emily Towns. But Murray very early on is putting in place the kind of critique of Black theology that James Cone's students would then build on.
Do you think it's fair to say that Murray anticipated our modern focus on intersectionality, that that's a word that describes some of her work?
Of necessity. Again, moving from the individual to the collective. For Murray, I would think there are ways in which what she's thinking and what she's doing certainly shadows intersectionality, right? This is the way she's maneuvering. Again, one, because of her personal engagement with the world, but secondly, through a deep sensitivity to what it means to be on the margins of American life. And she knew that that involved more than the race question. So sure.
A final question is about Murray's turn to the church. What drew her in, and what about being an ordained minister of the church was conflicted with her kind of more legal approach before that point?
Yeah, well, Murray was always involved in the church. As a small child, she's traveling, right? And she's involved in church services. So the church was always a part of her. It informed and fed her as an individual. I think in terms of ministry, it wasn't so much the legal mind, but it was this privileging of discomfort and disruption that was difficult, right? That it can be difficult to hold intention that demand for disruption, that demand for discomfort and tradition. There's a fundamental conflict between this conflict and demand for more and the "this is how we've done it" pronouncements. So more than the legal mind, it was her posture as an activist, I think, that most solidly and graphically troubles her relationship with the church as a layperson and as a minister.
And I'll fit one more final question in there because I noticed some questions I hadn't seen earlier. Someone wonders if you can speak a little bit about her poetry and the fact that she was such a versatile contributor to so many different disciplines.
Yeah. Well, very early on, she encounters some fabulous poets, right? And she is determined that her profession will be that of the poet. And so she has this book, Dark Testament, and we can wrestle over those poems and how they stand up within the larger tradition. But for her, this was going to be the career move. It did not pan out. She wasn't having the level of success that she anticipated or wanted. But there's something about the poetic impulse that remains with Murray. And when I say poetic impulse, this is what I mean. The destruction of language to free it to tell a different truth. And so there's something about Pauli Murray's writings from Dark Testament moving forward that are poetic in nature, that engage a kind of imaginative hermeneutic that disrupts language. It alters vocabulary and grammar in order to free us to tell a different truth, to tell a different story. It seems to me this plays out in the autobiography. It plays out in her sermons, that the poetic quality remains. There are ways, again, in which Pauli Murray remains a poet, although it's not her profession.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We've hit our time. Professor Anthony Pinn of Rice University, thank you so much for getting up early on Sunday and talking with us.
Well, thank you for the chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
And thank you all for watching. We hope you'll join us for worship at 11 a.m. and join us next week for the forum when we welcome author Austin Hartke, who will talk about gender diversity in Scripture. Thanks again for watching. Thank you so much, Professor Pinn.
Thank you.